Hey there, welcome to the Rooted in the Word podcast. This is Rob Armstrong, the pastor at Harrisburg Baptist Church. And so welcome those of you who are joining us by listening. Welcome to those of you who are joining us as we watch. My question for you today is it okay to question God? Now, for the past couple of weeks, I think many of us have been dealing with sicknesses and illnesses. I know my family has. I've had family members sick. I myself have been under the weather, hence the lateness of dropping this podcast to you. It's that time of year, so I want to apologize that we didn't get this to you any earlier. But I want to go back to that question. Is it okay to question God? And the reason that I pose that question for us to think about is because of our reading for this week. Job chapter 38 through 42. We have a moment where there's an exchange between Job and the Lord. And in this, we have God's response to Job, because there is questioning that occurs when we are dealing with suffering and difficulties. And so Job is questioning the Lord. And as you read through this, you're reading God's response to him. And it's a pretty massive response, because in the response, God shows us how big he is. And in doing so, gives us some contrast between us and him as to who we are not. But what amazing it is that we have a God who responds and who does give an answer to Job in the midst of his suffering. And then we see Job's response, which I would hope would be all of our response. I hope it'd be my response, that I would then trust the Lord as he responds to me and reminds me that he's the one who made everything. And he's had a plan for all that is happening on this earth, even before I came here. So as you read through Job, read that back and forth between God and Job and the questioning of, is it okay to question God? I would say there's a way in which, yes, it is okay to ask God for help and understanding. But if we're going to question, then we must receive the answer. And we have such a beautiful response from the Lord there in the book of Job. And when you move into the book of Genesis, as you keep reading in week 2's reading, you're going to read from Genesis chapter 11, I believe, through chapter 17. And in it, we are reading as God interacts with Abram and Sarai, and as God is making his covenant with him and moving that relationship towards the promises that God has made. And there are many things that I think we can think about. And so I would just encourage you to, at times, reflect a little bit and say, how would I handle this? And then I would encourage you to realize, like, God is asking you to handle this. He is calling you to people and to places. He is calling you to trust him in ways that maybe you've never trusted him before. And so when we begin to think about how this reading in week 2, as we work our way through the Bible, can help us as we stay rooted in the Word, how can that help us in our walks with the Lord? There were a few things I thought of that I would just pass on as you're reading this. One, God has obvious plans. We see it in the way that he is working and responding to Job. We see it in the plans that he has for Abram. We see not only does God have plans, but God actually has made promises to us. So it's not just that God says, go do these things that I have planned for you to do. There are promises that are accompanying those plans that God has for us. And it's because at the end of the day, there's a purpose for all of this. God has a purpose in creation. God has a purpose through creation, and God even has a purpose that he's going to carry out on the other side of the return of Christ. And so when we read through the book of Genesis, maybe the biggest word that I could get you to think of would be promise, or maybe an accompanying word would be covenant. That as you read through the book of Genesis, we're not just reading about the story of God making the world. In fact, that's just a couple of chapters. Instead, we are reading and being informed and made aware of who God is, the promises that he has made, the covenant that he makes that accompanies his plans and his purposes for us as his children. And we're seeing that made here with Abraham as we begin working further through the book of Genesis. So as you think about how this could impact you, regardless of what's going on, we need to do at least 3 things. One, we need to always remember who God is. Ultimately, that's why we have the Bible. It is a revelation of who he is. And there's such a clear picture of his might and his power and why we trust him and why we worship him there in the passages in Job that we read this week. And as you read through the book of Genesis, you continue to see over and over again who he is, that he is good, that he is powerful, that he has plans and purposes, that he's gracious, and that he's also true and righteous. But not only do we need to remember who he is, or do I need to even just today in my daily going, so I need to remember who he is, we also need to remember who we are and who we are not. For you see, one of the things that Job helps us As Job wasn't there when the foundations of the earth were laid. He didn't sit there and make sure that the waves only go so far. And it helps us to remember who we are by also remembering who we are not. And that helps us then, I think, to do the third thing, and that is to trust. We need to trust. If you're in a difficult, dark, hard situation, you can trust. You can trust the Lord. You may not be able to trust yourself. You may not be able to trust the people around you, but you can trust Him, that He is God and that He is good and that He is with you. And He's made promises to us that He is going to carry out in our life to care for us, and promises to watch over us and to be faithful to us. So you can trust Him in the midst of everything you're going through today. And you can trust Him with everything that's coming, that you can trust Him because of who He is. And then remember who you are and are not. And if you are His, then know those promises are yours, and you can trust Him, you can abide in Him, you can rest in Him, or as we say throughout this podcast, you can stay rooted in Him. It's Rob Armstrong with the Rooted in the Word podcast, and I will talk to you or see you next time.